And we are live, ladies and gentlemen. It's a hot Friday here in Johannesburg. The winter is over, and I think we may have skipped spring as well in South Africa. Um, but it's another episode of the Rational Standard, and I think the mood is quite somber today. I think, as everyone who follows the Rational Standard would probably know by now, the American conservative kind of activist Charlie Kirk, founder of Turning Point USA, was assassinated on Wednesday evening South Africa time at a event that he held at a Utah university in the United States. Um, quite graphic video of the whole thing happening. I wouldn't recommend anyone try and watch it. You'll find that content very easily, and it will stick with you. So I would recommend not going to find that footage. And yeah, I would say I never really engaged with Charlie Kirk's content personally. I've always been very aware of him and the work that he did, and I know that when he introduced Turning Point USA, he introduced it as an organization aimed at high school students and university students, specifically about promoting free market enterprise and limited government, which are values that I think all of us feel very strongly about. The consistency with which TPUSA stuck to those values, I think, is definitely an open question. But at the very least, Charlie Kirk was someone who existed at the periphery of our ecosystem, of our liberal, classical liberal, libertarian ecosystem. So there was definitely a high degree of awareness of the work he was doing. I always saw shorts being kind of promoted on my YouTube about him debating very and always respectfully with ideological opponents, kind of challenging their ideas and allowing his own ideas to be challenged. And yeah, he's been assassinated in what I would characterize, and I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself, but what I would characterize as a relatively new kind of event in the United States. Of course, there have been political assassinations in the United States quite recently. In fact, there are Democratic lawmakers I think, in Minnesota were assassinated. So this does happen, but I don't recall this happening to, let's say, ordinary activists, thinkers, what we would call shit posters, people kind of troll on social media. This does seem to me to be a new thing that's happened. So it kind of reminded me as well of my own mortality and of the mortality of my colleagues and of the people who we work with. That it's effectively something that could happen to any of us for having ideas that are not popular. Um, so yeah, I want to bring up David's column from today on the common sense, because he also reminded us that and I would recommend that everyone read this. David has a weekly column on the common sense. But you reminded us, David, that many of our colleagues in Africa kind of have to endure this as almost routine. I wouldn't say that assassinations are happening routinely in Africa, but there's certainly threats of violence, coercion, and certainly intimidation from the government specifically in Africa. But as far as kind of the Western world goes, I think we've by default assumed that you can say radical things. Even in South Africa, you can say radical things. You can say extremist things. Not that Charlie Kirk was by any stretch of the imagination an extremist. I disagreed with most of his views, but he was definitely a middle of the road kind of conservative. But we took it as an assumption that you could get away with saying things without any threat to your life. This is not the case in Africa, and now it seems, unfortunately, it's not necessarily the case in the United States either. And I'm going to give David and then Zakes, of course, a chance to say their piece if they have something on Charlie. But I want today's show to kind of be a little bit about exploring this idea of have we perhaps allowed the temperature of politics? And I must say, I have to. This is kind of for the West. I think in Africa and in the East, the temperature of politics has been turned up to 20 for a very long time. But now in the West, and I regard South Africa as kind of straddling the line between the West and Africa to some degree. Have we allowed the temperature of politics to be turned up so high that mere disagreements of opinion are now truly seen by some people as such a big threat to their vital interests that they would utilize violence in turn and assassinate the people they see threatening those interests? And I don't think this question is interrogated enough. I think that everyone is just constantly clamoring to turn up the dial of politics, turn up the temperature all the time, and I think there's at least something to be said about that. But David, I think given that you've written this column today, I'll throw the word to you first.
Yeah, Martin, I think this is really a turning point in not just American politics, but political discourse more broadly. And I just want to respond to what you were saying about the temperature of politics, because I think obviously politics is not just a polite debate around public policy choices or resource allocation. In many respects, it really is fundamental to the way we live our lives, and issues around equality, freedom, human rights. These are fundamental questions. But I think the concern here in this situation is that really we've gone beyond mere disagreement to the extent where people are willing to exterminate people for just holding a different belief system. And I think part of it is that, Marshall McLuhan spoke about the medium as the message. And whilst I'm an enthusiastic user of social media, and even what we're doing today is putting our ideas out into the world, I do think that the incentives at play in the algorithmic context of many social media platforms is that these extreme views do rise to the top, and it's very easy to caricature your opponents and to dehumanize them. I do think that is a feature of extreme leftist politics. When you, and perhaps collectivism more broadly, when you see people as members of a group, as an amorphous kind of entity rather than as a human being, it's very tempting, I think, to erase their humanity and to justify actions like this. If you think of extremist religious movements as well, are prone to this, where they feel a kind of a divine calling or justification for religious-based terror, for example, ethnic cleansing or genocide. These are essentially premised on dehumanizing the other. And so I do, whilst I see this as potentially a moment to sort of be magnanimous and to try and reach out and rediscover the common humanity, I do think that this is a feature of the collectivist idea that we stand against, that basically, even if you consider calls to nationalize an industry or to impose confiscatory taxes or to expropriate property without compensation, these are all forms of violence. They're less dramatic than what we witnessed this week. You don't see necessarily the blood spraying on your video feed, but really these are instances of coercion. And to me, I think the tragic events that we saw playing out in Utah are a reminder to reaffirm our basic values, and to get back to, well, what are the core ideas that should be guiding us in the West more broadly? And I think South Africa can be considered part of the West, even though, as you said, it does skirt that line. So, and my piece is really a reflection on freedom of speech itself. And I think you can maybe have policy disagreements or different interpretations or different ways of seeing the world to Charlie Kirk, but what he embodied in his work and in his persona was a real commitment to the ideal of freedom of expression. And that freedom of expression is not just for the ideas that you like, but also the ideas that you fundamentally oppose. And that these are really the rules of the game that guide a free society as it grapples with complexity and trying to trying to make sure that people's rights are respected and so on. So yeah, I think the fact that he was killed in the middle of doing what he did best, which was engaging college students, and I haven't seen the footage. I've tried to just not kind of expose myself to that, but my understanding is that he was in the middle of making a point about how civic discourse is an antidote to violence, and that if we don't find a way to constructively disagree with one another, then the end result will be violence. And apparently that was the last word out of his mouth before he was slaughtered. And also some other dark ironies. I mean, the fact that he was shot in the throat was an ultimate form of silencing, but then also the fact that he was a fairly iconoclastic person, an autodidact who basically didn't go the traditional credentialized route, that he didn't go to university, but he was obsessed and really animated by ideas, and spent his time challenging the elite credentialed class on their home turf about the nature of democracy and justice and freedom. I think the fact that he was killed on a university campus, I think, is also darkly symbolic of where universities are at the moment in terms of deviating from the original mission of being a place where you can freely exchange ideas and really push the bounds of knowledge. It seems that to me that many universities have succumbed to a kind of paralyzed orthodoxy that really stifles critical thinking and free debate. And so I think his death in that respect is also very significant. But yeah, those are just some of my impressions. I must say, I'm not just a cold, dispassionate analyst. I was very emotionally affected by this week's events. But yeah, like I said earlier, I think it's a reaffirmation of my core values and my mission to spread freedom in the world. And I know that for people like Charlie, that came at a very high price. But I think also his life is an inspiration to me about how to spread truth and light in the world. And long may he rest in peace.
Yeah, very well said. Zakes, any reflections from you?
Yeah, I'm a free speech absolutist. So, seeing people being killed whilst they are talking is not necessarily ideal, to say the least. I, like you, Martin, never followed Charlie. Turning Point is interesting. Charlie's ideas are interesting. I disagreed with quite a few of them, but we agreed on free markets whenever he intimated free markets and anything like that, or liberty or anything like that. So, I was never really invested in any of his ideas. And I find really the conversation, right? I think we currently don't have the facts. And to the opposite of what David said in saying that he finds it difficult to be magnanimous, I think that there's no basis to conclude until the facts are there for one to not be magnanimous, right? Like, speaking of universities, that Charlie traveled to all throughout the United States as being, avenues where free expression is not possible, but it was. That's how Charlie built his entire empire, by going to universities and doing those very same things. And we don't even know whether it was a university student who killed him. We don't even know whether a person who killed him is a leftist, a collectivist. And to your point, Martin, right, there was also recently an attack by someone who would be classified to be on the right on, democratic, I think Democratic congressmen or senators, or I don't know what they were, but they were political figures in Minnesota, right? And I think that helps at the very least right now, which I think you are correct in, like the temperature is so high and that people find it okay, primarily due to these extremes of demonization from the other side, right? Like the idea of the hysterical left, the collectivist left, the devilish left. I've seen people under every Barack Obama tweet call him Satan. And I don't think that is something that is like cool, right? As a free speech absolutist, of course, I want people to still be able to say all of those things. I've seen leftists, and I am a libertarian, they have said some horrible things to me personally, right? Outside of general people who represent the ideas that I do represent. But I think that, man, these it is at times like this for me, because I'm a free speech absolutist, where my ideals are even much more important to me. It is at times like these where I think the whole point, right? The reason I am a proponent of people talking is so that people can hopefully find one another. So I don't want to come to a point whereby we're saying that it is impossible to find one another. I don't think that is the case. You know, that is why even within libertarianism itself, you have people who have different understandings of liberty, consider themselves libertarians. When I'm vociferous in my opposition to them, I'd call them all socialists, from, you know, the democratic liberal socialists to, you know, the social liberals. But they aren't, and I would we share certain things that we can agree on. And I would like to think, even, you know, unless you are a pretty rabid, I don't know, crazy person who just wants to exterminate their opponents, which I doubt you'd even be comfortable saying, right? Because my entire belief in natural rights is that I don't think human beings are that's horrible naturally, right? But maybe you are the Austrian painter and you're like, I want to eliminate people altogether. And then we can make a point that we cannot reach you because you are like actually doing something. But on ideology, man, I think, you know, even Marx in his own warped, you know, messed up way cared about people. He thought that what he was doing was going to help people. So you can still communicate with someone like that. But of course, with communists, is that they build armies and they want to kill you. that is that is the marked difference. I think that we also should keep in mind, right? Is that there's that. But I think in also keeping that in mind, we should also keep in mind that on the right too, on people who believe in liberty, on people who believe in these ideals, there are some of them who take them so seriously that they are willing to inflict harm on those they think are threatening said ideals, even though in the immediate they aren't. So yeah, I think if we can take anything away, right, at least from, you know, from, I think Charlie embodied this, even though I disagreed with him on a myriad of issues, right? He was still willing to talk to people who disagreed with him fundamentally. And I don't think that we should lose that. You know, of course, this could go two, you know, two of either ways. This could be, as David said, a turning point where people are like, no, screw dialogue, screw conversations, doesn't work. They will kill you, even though we still don't know who killed Charlie and for what reasons, right? But that seems to be the dominating narrative. And I don't, I get it, but I don't see how reasonable it is. Or it could hopefully inspire people to want to talk, because we don't want that to happen. Like, let us talk more, because you see how messed up things can get if all the assumptions are true. And, you know, Charlie was killed by a leftist who disagreed with his views fundamentally, which of course is a reasonable assumption to make, because why else would an activist be assassinated, right? So yeah, I think I would prefer, as someone who believes in, you know, speech, the ability to convince people, which I think I am pretty okay at. Let us talk more. I think that would be something that even Charlie himself would want, instead of people just, you know, wanting to go the route of not talking. Because if we don't talk, then eventually, you know, or everything ends with dialogue, even the most gruesome of wars. Because, you know, I like this clip of the Japanese coming into into a US Navy ship off of Tokyo and like signing an official surrender. And this was after they dropped bombs. You know, I'm like, yeah, even at the end of the most horrific nuking ever known to humankind, it still came down to a bunch of dudes shaking hands and saying, cool, it's over now. we're done with. And I think that we can skip the nuking each other parts and just get to the point where we're like, okay, we're done with it. Or maybe we go back to fist fighting. I don't know. I don't think that, killing one another is ever acceptable. So there's that. It is unfortunate, of course, that someone has died. It is always unfortunate that someone has died, even though you disagree with them, of course. So yeah, there's that. But I hope we talk more. That is the takeaway from it.
Yeah, no, thanks, X. And I think, look, as you said, the facts aren't in yet, and I'm always, I think I'm guilty of this sometimes. I think this time I've actually been so taken aback by what happened that I didn't really say much about what happened in fact. So, but people are often quick to make assumptions about what the facts are. I know the popular website 4chan has already given a name to the shooter without the authorities having confirmed that, and I think that's maybe 4chan is right, of course, but I do think that there's a risk. There's a risk there. I remember with the Boston bombings a few years ago. I think Reddit also said, "Oh, it's this person. Look, I recognize them from the video. It's this person," and it turned out to not be that person, but that person's life was then ruined as a result. So yeah, I do think there is a lot of importance attached to just giving the facts a chance to come in. What I do think we can talk about, and what I do think we have to acknowledge, and I don't think this is in any way disrespectful of what happened, is that the knee-jerk reaction to call for more state involvement in various kind of dimensions of this is going to be the wrong reaction. Asmund Gold is a popular gaming channel on YouTube, various millions of subscribers. He wouldn't describe himself as right wing, but I think he kind of leans toward that crowd, even though his policy views, I would say, are slightly more to the left. But in the aftermath of the assassination, he said, for instance, that the reason kind of the temperature of politics is so high is because social media platforms like X and Reddit aren't regulated enough. They don't self-moderate, and therefore the government he very strongly implied this, the government has to kind of step in and ensure that effectively that temperature is kept cool. I think obviously this is a bad idea, and of course from the left, the usual reaction has come: guns, guns, guns. We have to take guns off the street. This is a gun violence problem, and obviously that is also not the right conclusion. The state in both instances, as far as kind of suppression of speech is concerned, and so as far as gun violence is concerned, the state is always going to be the biggest offender. So bringing in the state to kind of resolve this issue, I don't think is. I mean, I don't just think it simply isn't the right answer. The reality is, and I've said this on X, is that if you don't want there to be gun violence, you have to destroy all guns, like all of them. The army, the police, everyone has to be disarmed, and then you won't have gun violence. But ultimately, you'll have other forms of violence, and specifically, the people who do want to do harm they'll find a way to get guns. So I don't think having regulated firearms would have really changed this situation at all. The shooter, whoever they were, or whoever they are, they intended to do harm. They intended very much to bring someone's life to an end maliciously. And having decided that a law is saying you're not allowed to do this thing, that thing, and the other thing isn't going to stand in your way. And on free expression, I mean, I don't think the reality is, yes, sure, maybe if you are able to suppress radicalism, it does bring the temperature down. The unfortunate counter to that is that the state is never consistent in that. It will always allow the radicalism that it favors, and it will suppress the radicalism that opposes it very strongly. And I think you see that all around the world. We certainly see it in South Africa as well, where leftist extremism is encouraged. The kind of encouraging kind of nationalization of property and so on. This is kind of just seen as normal politics, and everything is fine. But the moment someone, for instance, starts calling for separatism, which is equally extreme on the other side as nationalization of property, then people start talking about, oh, it's treason and we have to do this. And it's like the state will never be consistent when it comes to how to regulate expression. So kind of now Americans feel very comfortable. The Republicans are in power, yippee. So now we have to regulate expression. It's going to be a very, very short and sad story if that is going to be the way Americans want to react to this. And obviously, Charlie Kirk would have been one of the greatest victims of a policy of this nature. So there would be no justice really in doing that. And I think the other point someone also made that I responded to on X was, clearly this is now the need to regulate the guns. And I said, just to be clear, if I am ever murdered by someone wielding a gun, do not interpret that as me now endorsing the anti-firearm agenda. Please, I will be posthumously pro-gun. I will remain pro-gun regardless of that. So I just want to put that on the record. But yeah, just we have a high temperature of politics. We have to culturally and socially find a way to lower that temperature. If we immediately skip those necessary steps, number one, we're not solving the problem, but number two, we're skipping over to politics immediately. And by calling for politics to solve the temperature of politics, you can see the kind of error in thinking there. You're just going to make it worse ultimately. So yeah, David.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, Martin. And yeah, I think it was Ben Shapiro. He was being interviewed on the Free Press, and he was saying, one of the problems is the use of the third person plural when referring to your ideological opponents. Like, they shot Charlie, they did this, they believe that. But it was an individual who shot Charlie, and that person should be held to account for those actions. But I think the point that Shapiro was making was, also kind of broadly on the ideological left, there's been a what he terms, I think, a permission architecture, or a discourse that has created a conducive environment for these kinds of extreme actions to take place. And yeah, so I think that is worth thinking about. But I absolutely agree with you, Martin. We need to counter this through dialogue, through shifting back to the core norms, the core values of a free society, and what it means to be doing that. And that requires being equally critical of the right as it is of the left. If somebody killed Bernie Sanders or AOC, I think that the condemnation for that should be equally vociferous. And I hope that something like that does not happen. Yeah, I think what we want to avoid is for this situation to escalate. But yeah, I mean, I have been heartened to see, the likes of Barack Obama and other Democrats coming out in kind of full-throated rejection of political violence. And I think that shows real leadership, and I think that's very important. But yeah, just to explore a bit more the idea of freedom of speech and why it matters, as I highlight in my column today, this is also a way in which society progresses. It helps you, in the words of John Stuart Mill, to replace error with truth. And I think it's freedom of expression is not just a nice to have. It's really a foundational freedom upon which other freedoms rest. So, if you consider your freedom of assembly or right of association, that would be really a paper right or an impossible right without the ability to persuade, to articulate your views, and to pull people over to your side. Religious freedom is impossible without the freedom to critique orthodox, established religious doctrine, which can easily descend into dogma if you don't have the ability to kind of interrogate those viewpoints. Scientific advancement that requires new ideas. Max Planck said that science advances one funeral at a time, which is quite slow. So you want to be able to challenge the established truth. And in the piece, I talk about Nicholas Copernicus, whose dangerous idea in the 1500s was to proclaim that maybe Ptolemy was wrong and that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, and that actually there's a different theory, a heliocentric theory, which now today we take for granted, that the earth revolves around the sun. That's an established truth, but 500 years ago that was not the case. And there are probably many ideas that we hold to be true today that are probably, with the passage of time, going to be revealed to be rather silly, and people will wonder, why did we hold these views? And so the light that free expression offers is the best disinfectant. It enables us to really interrogate the world around us. And as you said in your opening, I think this really was driven home to me and Zakes when we were in Nairobi last month. It was, I think we were, I don't know if I speak for Zakes here, but very impressed by the kind of level of courage and commitment and the energy that some of our partners in other African countries have shown. They're doing great work in difficult circumstances, but I think it also made us appreciate the rights that we do have in South Africa to be able to criticize freely and to put forward alternative ideas, and we should preserve that and guard that right very jealously. So I think we mustn't lose sight of really some of our most cherished guiding values in this time. And I think sometimes it's often times of acute crisis where people are tempted to jettison some of these values, but I think we should actually double down and say, well, why is this important to us? And I think that would be the best way to honor Charlie Kirk.
Absolutely. Zakes.
Yeah. I mean, on the free expression part, right? It's important, and David was right. Like seeing people from the African continent, which for me really is home and the place I love the most and all. So, seeing people from places like Mali and, who live in, military regimes, yet they are advocating for ideas that undermine those military regimes. I still have a close friend from there that I try to talk to for Mali, because he's people like that to me are the coolest, right? Those are people who are willing to stand in the face of, and not to undermine anyone in the Western world who advocates for these ideas, but if you're willing to stand in the face of a state that you have seen execute people, and you say, now I want to be free, that takes a whole lot of courage. And this is the power of free expression, and it made me appreciate the free expression we do have here at home, right? Like, even though I disagree with our conception, we have hate speech, which is a problematic thing. For me, as a free speech absolutist, but that's okay, because if Charlie Kirk was probably in South Africa, he would have, had to be apologize in some sense because of hate speech. But different sections of the South African population appeal to hate speech whenever it is most most appealable to them. So there's that. But free expression is man, it is so important. As David says, it makes everything possible. For me, that is why not the end in and of itself, right? The reason I want to freely express myself, so I can convince people that liberty is superior, because it is, right? Like, liberty allows you to freely express yourself. And a lot of people who are conservative, who aren't the biggest fans, who are like people, as you said, Martin, like Esmond Gold, right, who wasn't fully bought into the idea of free expression, and they are comfortable saying the state should regulate you. They don't get they think this is the weakness of liberalism. They always say that liberalism is the paradox of tolerance, right? As people would say, that you are even willing to tolerate things that undermine your position. But I think that is the strength. I think if your position is undermined by the tolerance of ideas, then I don't think your position is that strong to begin with, and that helps you to strengthen it. But yeah, I am an idealist when it comes to these ideas, when it comes to the ability to express oneself, and most especially in the African continent, I think we need it the most, because here, Martin, as you said, if the West is getting hot, we are in hell, in like the deepest level of it, because here, just north of us in Zim, there are journalists. I think that I forgot his name, and I'm sorry for that. But there's a journalist who's currently, I think has been held in prison for more than a couple of months in Zimbabwe for writing a piece critical of the president there and his, patronage network, and that is the norm. Zimbabweans wake up the next morning and they carry on with their lives, and that is it. And they know for sure to never ever question the government. And that to me is heartbreaking. That to me is the reason I'm a libertarian. And I think we can use and I guess I feel horrible saying using someone's death, because it sounds pretty messed up, because but it can be used instead of a catalyst for killing dialogue. It can be used at least for in places where dialogue does not exist, to say that, look at this dude who you probably disagree with, and his society allowed him. Of course, he ended up being assassinated, unfortunately, but for a short while, his society allowed him to say that, transgenders and everything, and every opinion he could have that was totally antithetical to the audience that he was presenting it to. And he was never arrested by his government. He was allowed to go home, and up until a couple of days ago, no one had assassinated him. At least, even a couple of days ago, no one in the audience, the people who were actually there to engage him, some of whom were probably disagreeing with him, right? No one, they didn't assassinate him. The assassin was probably far away, but do we consider him part of the audience? I don't know. But either way, I think, I love free expression way too much. I want us to stick to that. And yeah, remember that people are individuals, right? To Ben Shapiro's point, stop saying they killed him. I think that was my biggest problem. Like, someone killed him. A single person killed another single person. You could argue that their ideals motivated them, but we cannot know that until that happened. So, sticking to our core values. I think, yeah, this made me even more libertarian. And two, all on the record, I am for armed citizenry. I want each and every single household to have a gun. If I'm ever shot, I don't want someone to be like, you see, of course you can raise it. And he was shot by his ideas. Yes, that would be reasonable of you. Very shitty for you to do, but it would still be pretty reasonable, and I would accept that. But I would not regret that. And I think, yeah, let us continue talking. I think for me that is my takeaway. I said, as a free speech absolutist, it was when I first saw the Amsterdam, because yeah, it was shock. I'm a talker. I was like, man, I could have been talking to someone and saying commies suck and Pinochet was great, and then something like that happened. But yeah, it is pretty unfortunate. And for the African continent, we need more liberty. That for me it reaffirms it. We need, in Africa at least, 1 million Charlie Kirks that I can disagree with and say that this guy needs to read more. But yeah, I would prefer those to exist and not be in jail, rather than them not being there at all. So yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and I think the key worry that I've had increasingly in South Africa is that the continental tradition of we will not speak ill of the powerful has been seeping in. I think to some degree, we still have more robust free expression than even places in Europe, certainly more than the United Kingdom, for example. I wouldn't say we're quite on par with the US yet, but as far as Europe is concerned, I think South Africa kind of does much better. But in recent months, I mean, two very recent examples that came very quick on each other was the first one was a guy, and I don't recall his name. He owns a dross in a restaurant in the Cape, I think. and he had the faces of Julius Malema and Cyril Ramaphosa and I think Paul Mashatile or something, kind of uh, uh, put images of them on the urinals in the bathroom, and he has been taken by the Human Rights Commission to the Equality Court. So that's a civil suit, but that is still a state institution going after someone for, I mean, like David says in his column, kind of perhaps distastefully. I'm not sure that it's distasteful. I think kind of pissing on some of these people's faces is very much earned, but certainly distasteful to many connoisseurs of culture, and the state institution is saying you cannot do this. So he is being placed in jeopardy. And more recently, and I think far more worryingly, far more worryingly, is a guy called Anton Taylor, who is a rabid leftist radical who I would say I think I despise his views. Like, I think this guy is extremely toxic, but his home was raided by the Hawks because he made fun of the former police commissioner. I mean, that is completely unacceptable. That is some real kind of banana republic stuff. Regardless of what I think of him, that cannot happen. And the fact, and this is my real worry, the fact that that was not immediately welcomed by protests and riots and people saying this will not stand, that is what worries me the most, because to some degree, and I don't know if South Africans are just exhausted by our politics, but to some degree we said, well, that's unfortunate, but okay. And if you do that, you normalize it. You normalize this type of thing happening, and the next small thing, and the next small thing, and a little bit of bigger thing, and a little bit of a bigger thing, and eventually nothing is left. That is how these things could play out, and we have to be very jealously guarded of the very robust allowability to say perhaps some of the most despicable things, and to perhaps to express in, we don't have to say it, but express it some other way, to express some of the most despicable things. That is very important. It is the example of Copernicus is a key one, because in his time, it wasn't that they said, like they do today, oh, he's spreading disinformation or misinformation and it's not scientifically accurate, and therefore the government has a role to kind of protect truth. That is not what they said. They thought this is offensive. This kind of strikes at the very core of our kind of worldview. This is like, how dare he say this? They were that society was deeply offended by the views that he held, and that is why the state went after him. So it's not about just this kind of idea of, yeah, sure, if you say the true thing, then that's fine, and if you say a false thing, then we need to be careful about fake news and so on. No, it's measured by how deeply offended you are, and the more deeply offended you are, the more the protection for speech has to kind of kick in. That's what it comes down to. So we need to be very conscious of that, because the threat to this chaos, with this very welcome disorder, is coming from all sides. And I think to his credit, to Charlie Kirk's credit, and I know some of us here kind of disagree about matters of geopolitics. Charlie Kirk was very pro-Israel, but when some university or some state institution try to tell uh, pro-Palestinian protesters at a campus that they cannot do it, there was something like that, then he said, no, listen, they have a right to express these views, and we have to engage with these views no matter how much we disagree with them. So that's why I think it's important to note that this guy was more or less a moderate, and he did believe in open dialogue. And I think that makes his death all the more tragic. If it was a real radical, if it was one of those guys who really said, listen, all you buggers, we're gonna put you in camps and we're gonna get you, and that person was assassinated, I wouldn't say that that's a good thing necessarily. I would have said that at least I get it. But with someone like Charlie Kirk, it's very difficult for me to get. It's very difficult for me to understand, because there's this theory kind of in transitional politics and so on. Do not eliminate your enemies as most moderate people. I mean, really that should kind of speak for itself. I mean, you do not want to kill the most moderate people on the opposite side of you. These are, in fact, the people that you have the greatest chance of influencing. These are the people that you have the greatest chance of having a good dialogue for. And if you start targeting them, not to say you should go and kill the radicals, but it's a very counterintuitive thing to do. So it's been very difficult these last 2 days for me to wrap my head around exactly what the hell is going on. At least with we've been chatting about Africa. With Africa, I get it. I understand. Again, to take it back to the temperature of politics, I understand that the elites in these African countries, it's not politics as the West knows it. Politics is these people's whole lives. If they're not the president of the country, they have nothing. If they're not the local kind of counselor in an area, they have nothing. That is all that they have. That is their whole identity. So I understand to some degree why in Africa freedom of expression is so harshly suppressed. There is no culture of kind of dissent, at least not a recent culture. I know Zakes has written quite a bit about pre-colonial kind of Africa and how free expression thrived here, but it's not a recent thing. And we've allowed on the African continent politics to become so entwined with identity that I do get it. And the West, I think, has been able to a large degree, although it's increasingly less so, has been able to separate your political identity from everything else, and that's so crucial. And that's why I'm very concerned and very confused about what is going on in the US. I think this is taking a very bad turn for that society, for Western kind of values in general. And yeah, just for the ability to understand reality, because I think increasingly there was that attack on that Ukrainian woman in the US as well recently, which was equally morbidly shared on social media. But at least initial indications are that it was a mentally ill man who did that to her. And I wouldn't be surprised if we discover that the assassin of Charlie Kirk also had some psychological issues. So the kind of understanding the thinking behind these events, I think, is going to become increasingly difficult, just because ultimately there isn't going to be thinking behind it. It seems to be getting increasingly random. And that's I think all the more reason why we need to be very careful about what we say needs to happen next, because I think a lot of it is going to be actually just out of our control. And if we try to control it, we're going to create unintended consequences that's going to be very deleterious to freedom for the rational amongst us. David.
Yeah, a few thoughts. I mean, I think what's also troubling about Charlie Kirk is, I think it's very easy to caricature your opponents when you're sitting behind your laptop or on your phone and kind of slag them off on Twitter or Facebook. But the fact that his mission was to go and have in-person dialogue with people, I think that was a commendable, but ultimately, tragic result emanated from that. That was a commendable methodology that he had. But yeah, I think also with freedom comes responsibility, and yeah, we must be careful with our words, because our words, can also. We were talking about Africa. I mean, 30 years ago in Rwanda, there were 800,000 people who were slaughtered because they were whipped up into a frenzy. Well, Hutu nationalists were whipped up to violently attack the Tutsi population. And there was widespread use of radio broadcasts and things that were used to coordinate that genocide. And yeah, I think we just also need to reflect on how we discuss the facts of the matter. I mean, I think we've rightly been saying we need to await for facts to emerge. But I think one of the characteristics of a contemporary world is that even the basic elementary facts are often disputed. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the attack on Ian Cameron in Philippi. And, people were saying, well, they were unarmed people who were confronting them in their cars. So, well, no, they had bricks in their hands. They were definitely armed, and they were inflicting violence upon those people. So I think we also kind of need to find a way of agreeing on foundational truths and then debating about our interpretations, perhaps. But you also need to have some kind of adherence to a kind of coherent set of facts. So and I think when we look at across the political spectrum, we also need to be consistent. And in the weeks preceding Kirk's death, there's been debates around flag burning, for example, in the United States, and the Trump administration wants to kind of ban burning the American flag. And you can understand there's an impulse of, well, you must take pride in your country and what have you, but that is a basic right. There's a long tradition of flag burning as a form of legitimate protest. And however uncomfortable or queasy that makes you, if you're an American nationalist, for example, you kind of have to bite that bullet and say, well, that is legitimate speech. So, I think we just need to kind of have universal application of some of these principles if we're to take them seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's always the thing. You always have to assume your opponents will govern with the powers you use to protect yourself, and that's the end of you. Jakes.
Oh yeah, I think you raised a pretty good point, Martin, about how everything always rolls back to having smaller stakes and allowing people to be much more free. Because when you say that, people's identity is politics, that is true, right? Like their sense of being is tied to whatever political policy position one might hold. And you see this on the left, right, with people who identify like being transgender. If you are a transgender or gay person, right, this is a critical part of your identity. And when we take that and we make that a public policy position, then it means that a part of your identity is now open to debate on the political sphere. Now it is no longer about whether I pay 15 or 10% on my taxes or anything like that. Now it is whether, are you saying I can exist or I can do this or not? Because, this is something that you are tied to. This is for the people on the left for various identities. And then on the right, you see it with one of the disagreement points that I had with, guys like the Kirks of the world is that the Christian nationalism or the religious nationalism aspects of it. One's religion is one's identity. A lot, like everyone who's religious would say that the first thing that they put above all else is their religious deity. And when that is inserted into the political sphere, then it is no longer about just politics. Now it is about you are denying my God, you are undermining my God, blaspheming my God. And this creates the most horrible of conditions on both sides, because you are now no longer discussing things that you can walk away from and say, okay, we can agree to disagree. Like disagreement in these matters in most cases they're not, right, means a fundamental like a fundamental I don't think you should exist, or your sense of being is not real and should not be considered. Like that makes it that much more harder for people to kind of walk away agreeing to disagree. And it is unfortunate. It is here now, like it is here. I don't know how we'll respond to it, but yeah, it is. Of course the response is the state not to be involved in all of that and to stick to just protecting life, liberty, and property. That is what it should do, and not be involved in social issues. But we have social rights, and that really kind of necessitates the involvement of all of these things. So yeah, Yeah, I just thought that was a good point you made about
Yeah, and
how
also,
identity and everything is connected. Okay, yes, David.
sorry, I didn't realize you were
Oh yeah,
still
no,
finishing.
it's okay.
Fine.
But yeah, I also think, we often rail against statism, but it's not just that the government has too much power, but actually there are other legitimate spheres of authority in society that we need to elevate. And I think what's quite tragic about Charlie is that he wasn't just an office bearing politician. I mean, obviously he was very much a political actor. But even if you just think of the extremes of politics in the United States at the moment, the stakes are so high because you're incentivized to capture that vast apparatus of the state and use it to advance your agenda. And so actually developing very strong civil society movements, religious organizations, voluntary associations, these are the kind of real building blocks of a society. And the tragedy is, I think, Zakes's first principles formulation of what the state should do, the protection of life, liberty, and property, is really so core. But with every passing election, we have a new layer of state power that's just added on top of that. And the incentives are so high to keep adding more layers and not removing layers. I think that's what's so remarkable about Javier Milei, is that he's not just cutting the waste of government. Like, he's not just improving the efficiency of spending on government. He's actually rolling back the power of the state, which is actually a far more formidable and difficult task to achieve. So I think we really need to get back to that. Is, okay, well, how do we cultivate spheres of authority outside of the government, but also inculcate a sense of leadership? And I think regardless of Kirk's political or religious views, I think he was genuinely a natural leader. He was somebody who was he saw a lot of disaffected youth, men in particular, who were being alienated by the political process, and he was genuinely moved to try and elevate them and improve their standing in life. And so I think there's different ways of doing that. You don't necessarily have to be fighting it out in the halls of a legislature or capturing the levers of power in the executive office of the president. You can do that in your own small way, in your own personal interactions. And yeah, so I think that's a good lesson to take out of this.
Yeah, and it's I think that point about how it's coming from both sides is key, because Zakes was speaking about how kind of religious, and I think, David, you spoke about it earlier, kind of religious identity becomes so entwined with politics, and then when that's in any way challenged, necessarily, if you're religious, you will react very often violently to that. And that's why I think that, and I mean, it might seem self-serving, but as a classical liberal or libertarian, I do insist that our worldview is in fact the solution to this issue, and that is a wholesale secularization of the state. I say this as a Christian, as someone who is very self-consciously and openly Christian. The state has to be completely secular, not just religiously, but also, again, on gender and so on. Like, I very firmly believe that there are only two sexes, men and women, and kind of the rest is at best very exceptional. Um, but that is not a political statement. That has nothing to do with the state. A lot of conservatives in the US, when Justice Jackson, when she was being interviewed to become the newest and youngest member of the Supreme Court, she was asked, please define a woman, and she said she won't because she's not a biologist. That is the correct response for a judge to make. Now, I don't know if she did that as a judge or whether she was trying to make a political statement, but if you're a judge and no one has presented evidence to you, your response is simply, I don't know. That is what you have to say. And that is what the state has to stick with. The state has no interest in defining who is male and who is female in society. And now it's become such a politicized thing that even normal cisgender straight kind of men and women also feel that they now have this political interest in just being normal. So that just ups the ante on everything. And certainly people who are transgender now also have this massive vested interest in protecting the domain of politics that they have been able to secure for themselves. But that is so dangerous. The obvious solution, and I really think the only solution, is not to get the state to agree with what our version of objective reality is, which I think there is only one. But the point is, we all disagree about what that one thing is, and we can't dismiss that reality blithely. Like, it's a reality. I would love it if everyone agreed about how the world worked, but we're not close to there. And maybe up until we get there in 1,000,000 years and 2,000,000 years, for the time being, the state must have no view on it. That's not to say the state is neutral, and I must emphasize this, because this is a straw man of liberalism that is very often made. This idea that, oh, you want the state to not take a view on anything. No, we want the state to take a very firm and in my monarchist view, I know Zeke's you're an anarchist, but in my monarchist view, the state must take a very vicious view on the protection of liberty and property. Like, it is not neutral by any stretch of the imagination. If someone's liberty and property is being threatened, the state must exercise extreme violence in protecting people's liberty and property and their lives, etc. So that's liberalism is not about getting a neutral state, but it is a secular state that does not suppose to tell people how they should live, what their identity should be, etc. And the thing about flag burning, that plays into it as well. The kind of patriotic nationalist identity. One would imagine the state has an interest in protecting that, but it shouldn't. It really shouldn't. It should say, here are more flags for you to burn. That is what the state should be doing. So it's a very dangerous game, how we've elevated the temperature of politics, and it's always in the public interest. Remember, it's never saying, oh, we're just going to generalize everything and then we're going to have trouble about that. Like national health insurance in South Africa, we must do it because, of course, it's for public health and the national interest and the public interest. But just imagine, now we have a generation of NHI, and now someone says, okay, but we have to end the NHI like in 100 years. You, as someone who thinks you have benefited from the NHI, you see that, you perceive that as a very direct attack on your vital interests. They're trying to take my healthcare away. So you're taking away the ability to debate something as simple as public health policy. If you do it, you're trying to take someone's healthcare away. So it's very dangerous. I mean, it's happened with education. Like if I think all of us here agree that the state shouldn't really play too much of a role in education, if any. But if you say that in public and you say we must reduce funding for teachers, we must reduce funding for education, people react. Like I don't want to say they react violently yet, but they're a few steps removed from reacting very violently to us even deigning to say such a thing, when in fact it should never have been a contentious subject to start with. And David, you make the point there about the solution to that is you decentralize, you diffuse the power. Education, if it has to be a state thing, at least make it a extremely local state thing, so that not everyone has this vested interest in where education funding is going and how the policy is administered. But at best, it should be a completely private thing. That goes for healthcare, that goes for gender, that goes for patriotism, whatever have you. And that is how you reduce the temperature of politics. We are at an hour, gentlemen. I'm going to give each of you a chance to give some parting thoughts, and then I'll close it off for you, for us. David.
Martin, it might be a naive thing to say at this moment, but I think we should recognize one another's common humanity and fall back on the principles of empathy, kindness, understanding, knowing that we have very different views of the world sometimes as people, but that shouldn't mean that we should hate one another and try to silence those voices. We can work it out in this crazy, messed up world that we find ourselves in, if we just use the tools of freedom that have been given to us. Those are inalienable rights, and we should exercise them with responsibility, but also freely. And I think may we live in better times in the future and take something more positive out of this tragic circumstance.
Well said.
Oh,
Thanks.
Really, let us be committed more to freedom. I think let us love it more. Let us embrace it more. As I said, I'm very idealistic, British romanticism when it comes to freedom. I love it a great deal. I find it to be an amazing idea. And you're right, Martin, may be biased, of course, but the solution to every horrible thing in the world truly is our ideas. I know you may think, these guys, but that is the solution. Just live and let live. I think we need to embrace that, the basic tenets of of this great thing called liberty. So yeah, let's live and let live, and yeah, hopefully the world will be a less shitty place tomorrow.
Yeah, well said. Thank you, Jakes. Yeah, no, laissez-faire, let in, let live. These are, in our view, really the solutions to bringing the temperature of politics down, way down, rolling back that dial, maybe to a point where it never was before, but hopefully we can get it there. Certainly not in my lifetime, but hopefully in future generations, we will see people just being calm, just being focused on living life without trying to impose anything on those around them. Wouldn't that be great? But yeah, that is it for this week's episode. I think just a final word of condolences really to Charlie Kirk's family. Young, beautiful family that now is sans a husband and a father. And of course, to the many other families around the world who have lost loved ones specifically to political violence. And then even more particularly to those few, I hope, who have lost loved ones to mere differences in opinion. That is really tragic, and let's work together to ensure that stops. Certainly in the West, I think has the best chance of stopping that quickly, but the rest of the world has to get with that as well. Ensure that mere differences of opinion are not resolved in this violent way. But if you've enjoyed Rational Standard, even this very somber episode, please do subscribe to our channel. Do like the video and share it. Please restack on Substack at rationalstandard.com or .co.za, both work. Please restack this video and a lot of our other content that we share there, mainly written content that goes there daily. Yeah, I think that's it. We will catch you all again next week, Friday, noon. As always, cheerio, go well, and stay cool in this very hot South African weekend.